So we're now at our last part of the conference, and for those who came up with the film yesterday, thank you very much. So Ian will talk a little bit about the film, and then we'll continue on with and then we'll go into the seminar part on how to be a global career activist, and he'll be sharing some of his experiences and advice for being in the field. So.
Okay, who went to the film last night? And I suppose others of you have seen it. Anybody who has not seen the film? Okay, well, those of you who went last night, you had heard a little bit more about the background. What did you make of the film? And how did it look the second time around, or at least when you know more about the subject? Did you notice the mountain, the computer graphics on the mountain?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You had mentioned that look at who's setting up the Kimberley process, and it's exclusively Western countries. They use the Canadian flag and the Dutch and the British and Germans, I think, as well. But there didn't seem to be any representatives of any African states there.
Yeah, in fact, the American delegate talks about the need for something like this. In fact, the Kimberley meeting, the first Kimberley meeting was called in South Africa by the government of South Africa. They championed the whole thing for the first 3 years. Without them, I don't think we would have had anything like that. And the United States actually dragged its feet. George Bush, if you remember at the beginning of George Bush's administration, he was actually pulling out of all kinds of multilateral agreements, and this shows the U.S. as being a leader in the thing. The U.S. really dragged its feet. It was not very keen. It tried to block all kinds of things in the agreement. They were just as troublesome as the Russians and the Chinese. None of the big countries were very keen on this, so that was a bit of a failing. I don't know whether you noticed there was a mention of Global Witness. There's a scene where Jennifer Connelly talks to Leonardo DiCaprio about some article that Global Witness has written. In fact, Global Witness was the first NGO to notice this blood diamond problem, and they had written about it. But it was about Angola. They didn't have anything to do with Sierra Leone. It was the organization that I worked with, Partnership Africa Canada. But Global Witness worked closely with Warner Brothers on the film. I don't know why the film got things like the American thing wrong, because Global Witness was there and obviously pumped up the Global Witness story, and we got left out. Warner Brothers did call us and asked if there was apparently going to be a scene where they were going to pan across all the people gathered at this Kimberley meeting, and there was going to be a Partnership Africa Canada representative there, and they wanted to ask permission if they could use our name in the film. Fine, sure, of course, please do. But I guess that got cut.
There were 4 Canadian flags in the room that were they had the people in the center, and then in behind there were 4 Canadian representatives. I noticed that.
Yeah.
I had to look at it more carefully. Maybe there was a name card there. What impression did you get about the conflict? What was the conflict about? Who were the good guys and who were the bad guys? I mean, obviously that monster who was chopping the hands off was not one of the good guys, but were there any good guys? Could you understand the conflict?
It wasn't very clear. There was the RUF and there was the government, and that was kind of it. It just seemed like, as you mentioned, there were a lot of rebel groups running around, and we were kind of left with not knowing what the greater concept of this conflict is. Is what mine was kind of how I felt when I was watching the second time.
Yeah, and then there was a colonel who was kind of DiCaprio's former employee or current who they were as a group, kind of paramilitary or something. That was kind of the fact.
It was kind of mind-boggling to me, and maybe you could shed some light if it was ever anything like that where a rogue South African military unit made it to Sierra Leone with helicopters to smuggle diamonds, or was that just completely made up for the movie?
Yeah, exactly.
No, that wasn't made up, but they got the timelines all confused, so some things happened way out of sequence. I mean, they sort of jammed it all into one storyline, one time frame. There was an organization called Executive Outcomes. Great name for a bunch of mercenaries, Executive Outcomes. And they were hired by the government of Sierra Leone because its own army simply was having no effect on the rebels. They hired Executive Outcomes to basically come in and try to push the rebels back. They had, I forget how many, they had about maybe 6 or 8 white South African officers, and altogether there were about 350 men that came. I don't know whether they had, yeah, they had a helicopter gunship, and they had some other equipment. The big thing that they had was sort of triangulation equipment so that they could find the rebels quickly. Whenever the rebels used a radio, they could find them very quickly. The rebels had never, they didn't know about this. So whenever they spoke on air, suddenly a helicopter came and just blasted the hell out of them. Executive Outcomes did that not for cash, because the government didn't have any cash. The trade-off was either, well, I don't know whether they actually got diamonds, but they got mining concessions. And there was a big row about this. The IMF wasn't happy. Others said this is terrible to hire mercenaries to, and then give them, I mean, basically rent the country out to mercenaries. They didn't last long. The first peace deal with the rebels, part of it was, part of the deal was that Executive Outcomes would leave. As soon as they left, the rebels canceled the deal and went back to war. So Executive Outcomes showed, actually, that a very small force could push these rebels back. The rebels were not soldiers. They were cowards, they were bullies, they were thugs, and they were not very good militarily. Later, when they almost took Freetown in it was 2000 or 2001, that's shown in the film. That's where they got it all mixed up. The British sent in about 300 Marines and went after them, and that, in essence, was the end of the RUF. There were already UN peacekeepers there. 500 of them were kidnapped, if you could imagine. 500, I mean, this has never happened in history. 500 UN peacekeepers were kidnapped by the rebels, and the UN was packing its bags. The diplomats were all heading for the airport. I mean, everybody was in a state of rout, and the British sent in these Marines. And they did the one thing that the rebels had really not experienced very much. They actually shot back, and with effect. I mean, they knew how to aim a gun. And that was more or less the end of the RUF. Bit of a lesson in that. You know, in the end, there were 17,000 peacekeepers in Sierra Leone. It didn't take more than 300, on 2 occasions, 300 or 400 half-decent soldiers to beat these guys. They were really just a bunch of marauding, cowardly murderers with very little organization. A lot of guns and a lot of violence, and that's what scared people. Everybody just ran from them. Okay, well, unless there are any questions about the film, we can move on to the rest. Okay, well, this is called Being a Career Global Activist. What I agreed with Maggie was that I would basically tell you a little bit about my career and how I got into this and how one thing led to another. And then we can talk about the way the opportunities have changed over the years for people who are interested in this kind of a life. When I joined, I told you yesterday that my introduction to this was joining CUSO, then called Canadian University Service Overseas, to go off and spend 2 years as a teacher in Sierra Leone. That was in 1967, and in those days, CUSO had become by then a very large organization. There were about 2,000 people in the field. About 1,000 new recruits every year were going off. Mostly they were teachers, but they were obviously looking for agriculturalists and engineers and medical personnel as well, but a lot of us were teachers. A lot of us were not trained teachers. We were just essentially BA generalists. But in the post-independence period, you know, independence movement really took hold in the early 60s, late 50s and early 60s. So as governments became independent, they were opening clinics and schools very, very quickly. Huge demand for new schools. The school that I taught at was only 2 years old when I got there. And so it was a high school, it had Form 1, Form 2, and the year I got there was a Form 3. The first class was moving on. So it was very new. It was, Koidu was the third largest town in the country, and yet that was the first secondary school. That was, you know, there had been no secondary school in that town right from the beginning of time. So it gives you a sense of, you know, what was missing and how fast independent governments, independent countries were trying to build up their own base. There obviously were not enough locally trained teachers or even university graduates to fill all the jobs. So they were keen to have Peace Corps, QSO, and from Britain, VSO, and others from other countries, Japan and Germany and France and elsewhere. I thought that I would do that for 2 years and then I'd come back and take law. My plan was to become a lawyer. But after the end of my first year, QSO asked me if I'd be interested in taking a field staff job. The condition was I would have to stay for another year. Would I be interested in going to Nigeria and working to help manage the program there? It was growing very rapidly and they needed another staff person. So I agreed, and that meant another year. That would take it up to 3 years. And then I decided to stay on for another year after that, so that became 4. Then I thought, okay, I really am interested in development. Maybe I will try to put this into some kind of context and go home and do a master's in development studies. By then, late 60s, early 70s, there were development studies programs coming up. I'd say in the mid-60s there was almost nothing like that. There was a bit of African studies in the US, but not much else. The guy who was the director of QSO in those days said, I was going to go to Carleton. He said, listen, if you really want to do development studies, why don't you go to a good university, not Carleton? He said, like Tufts or, you know, one of the bigger American universities. He said, but if what you really want is just to charge your batteries, come home and look around, he said, why don't you come and work with me for a bit and think about it. So that's what I did. I didn't go back to university. I worked with him for a year. And at the time, there weren't very many Canadian NGOs. There were church organizations. They were doing international development work. There was QSO, which had become the biggest very quickly. There were others like Crossroads International, which took mostly high school or people in university, but not graduates, off for seminar programs. There was World University Service of Canada that did seminar programs. We heard about that yesterday. They're still at it. But the sort of brand name organizations that we know today, like CARE, Oxfam, Plan, those ones were really branch plants. They were in Canada, but all they did was raise money and send it off to headquarters in England or the US. CARE was trying to Canadianize. CEDA was telling these NGOs, listen, we're not going to give you Canadian government funding and matching grants just so you can send it off to New York or Oxford or somewhere to spend. We want to see some Canadian value added. So CARE was looking for more Canadian field staff. They were trying to, not Canadianize, but get some Canadian content into the program. And they came up, they asked QSO to introduce them to the number of return volunteers that they might consider hiring. So I was put in charge of that. At the end of it, the guy said, well, I don't like any of them, but how about you? Why don't you come? So off I went with CARE to Bangladesh. It was right after it was a horrible cyclone. I mean, they said that the tsunami was the worst natural disaster of all time, but it wasn't. What happened in Bangladesh, the cyclone of 1970, was unbelievably bad. And then came the Civil War, which meant the separation of East Bengal, which was part of Pakistan, East Pakistan, separation of East Pakistan from West, and the independence of Bangladesh. There were 10 million refugees. There were 1 million people died. I mean, it was a very, very bad time. And CARE, being a relief and development organization, we were helping to pick up the pieces and do a lot of reconstruction. So I learned an awful lot with CARE, stuff that I didn't know and would never have learned from a Canadian organization, because there just weren't any that did things on that scale. But I realized that if I stayed with CARE, I would sooner or later get into a feeding program. CARE and a lot of American organizations did and still do move a lot of American food aid. And I had my doubts about food aid as a useful part of development. I mean, there's been major critiques of food aid since then, but it still goes on. And I was also afraid that I would become a permanent expatriate in an American organization. And I didn't really want to be not Canadian. I wanted to be Canadian in some way, and CARE in those days was definitely not Canadian. There were directives on how to make Canadians feel comfortable in CARE. The director was told that if you have a picture of President Nixon in your office, then you should also have a picture of the President of Canada. That was the kind of. Then I complained because we always got July 4th off in Bangladesh. I said, this doesn't make any sense. They said, well, you can take the Canadian day off. When is that? You can have that one off. So it was just not, there's something about it. I also began to see in Bangladesh that there were Bangladeshi organizations coming up that knew what they were doing, knew an awful lot more about what they were doing than we did. I don't know how many of you have heard about Engineers Without Borders, but somebody mentioned it last night, and they got into the news recently. They had their annual general meeting last weekend in Toronto, and they issued something called the Failure Report. And it's about failures. It's about things that their people have done that haven't worked and what they've learned from it. They asked me if I would put a chapter in, and I talked about my time in Bangladesh. So there's a section there that talks about my big thing. I mean, our huge project in Bangladesh didn't work. It actually failed. But what I saw were Bangladeshi organizations working on health and community development and all kinds of things who really did know what they were doing. And on one occasion, I had asked, we had a big housing project, and we were importing a lot of cement from Thailand. We were the only organization that was importing cement. I mean, we had freighters full of cement coming in for these houses we were building. And little organization, health organization, asked if we could add $10,000 worth of cement to one of our shipments. For them, they were building a clinic. They said, we'll pay you, and we'll pay you in dollars. We have money from an international organization. So I sent a cable to New York and asked if we could do this. And I said, they're a good organization. Can we also let them off the hook and just give them the cement? I mean, we had millions of dollars that nobody would ever notice. And I was very struck. For me, it was a turning point in my thinking about development. They said no. They said they were sure that it was a very good organization and it was a very worthy project, but this is not what CARE did. CARE just doesn't do this. We have a responsibility to our taxpayers, and we have to spend the money and manage it properly ourselves, which of course meant we have to do it all ourselves. And by then I knew the project wasn't working. I mean, it was not working. So all this, this much vaunted experience and knowledge and responsibility to donors and taxpayers that we were talking about didn't make any sense. And at the same time, we were refusing to support little organizations like this that were coming up and showing that they could do it as well or better than us. So I came home and worked for a year at the University of Western Ontario, and with a number of others who had worked for CUSO, we talked about starting a new organization. And in the end, we did. It was called Inter Pares. It's still there. It's a fairly well-known and well-respected, not huge, but a well-respected Canadian NGO. We had a lot of things on our mind, but one of the things that we wanted to do was to support local organizations. And in the mid-70s, that was a very radical idea. Oxfam was doing it a little bit, but not very many others were. NGOs were still very operational, sending Canadians and Americans and others out to plan, manage, and report on development projects. Now, of course, it's the done thing to support local organizations, if not to support them in what they're doing, at least to help try and build their capacities and so on. So we were kind of ahead of the pack, I guess, then. One thing led to another. After 4 or 5 years at Paris, I went back to CUSO as executive director. I was there from 79 to 83. I thought, going back to a big Canadian development organization as director, I would be able to really influence a big organization and other things, other trends in development. I found was that we were spending a lot of time arguing about stuff. There was an awful lot of arguing. We argued about everything from, you know, whether the Coke machine should be in the stairwell or whether it should be in the corridor. We argued about good development policy. We argued about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. But I was spending an awful lot of my time raising money, managing a herd of staff who all were going off in all directions. And when I left in '83, I wasn't sad to go. I had always wanted to write. I thought I'll go out. My wife was working in London. We were commuting, and that wasn't so good. So I thought I'll go to London and write the great Canadian novel. I didn't. I did, actually. I did write it, but it never got published. But at the time, I thought I needed to get CUSO out of my system, so I wrote a history of CUSO, and that did get published. And I wrote other books on development. Pretty soon, I realized that I was an expert. If you write a book, you must be an expert, right? And if you're an expert, then people want you to come and advise them, and then you become a consultant. So the writing didn't, if you write about development, you're not going to earn a lot of money. So I realized that writing wasn't going to pay for the eating habit. I really needed something else, and so I found that I was a consultant with writing on the side. Lately I got out the great Canadian novel, and I can see why it wasn't published. It was one of the first things I wrote, and it's not all that well written. But it's a good story. I did a lot of research on it, and now I'm rewriting it. I'm sure this time it'll get published. Things for you to think about in terms of your careers. Things have changed a lot. As I said, in the 60s, there was CUSO, so there was 1,000 opportunities every year for young people to go overseas if they wanted, and you didn't need a lot of skills and training. That, of course, has changed dramatically. There are still a lot of volunteer sending organizations. CUSO is there. There's WUSC, which does its seminar, but WUSC also sends people out for 1- and 2-year postings. There's CESI, there's at least 5 or 6 different volunteer sending organizations. But things have changed in the developing world now. They have lots of graduates of their own. They don't need a lot of BA generalists, and they don't need a lot of school teachers. They need people with more experience, and often with the kinds of experience that's, that only comes with work, work here in whatever field you're in. Often they want technical experience, they want engineering experience, they want agricultural, medical, that kind of thing. So the demands have changed, and the organizations that send people have had to change as well. They don't send as many, and they are looking for older, more mature, more experienced people. But a couple of other things have changed as well. One is that there are now many more NGOs doing things overseas, many more Canadian NGOs. Those that look like branch plants have had to become Canadian. So Plan, CARE, Oxfam, World Vision Canada, all of these organizations actually have quite large staff, some overseas and some that fit into their international operations. So CARE Canada might might not be huge in the general scheme of care things, but it means that it's part of the care world, and if Care Bolivia, which is maybe run by Care Australia or Care USA, if they need staff in a certain area, they can get them from Canada as well as any place else. So there are more opportunity, more staff opportunities than there ever were. And as I say, many more NGOs out there now than there once were. Something that started up about 10 or 15 years ago are internships. There just weren't short-term placements for people, except the WUSC seminar. There weren't very many short-term placements for people until about 15 years ago. And CETA began to support the idea of internships. So opportunities for students or others who want to go off for a month, 2 months, 3 months during the summer, or some other period to work on a project. This came up, and I think there were probably at the height of the internship thing, there were probably 700-800 opportunities a year. I'm not sure how many there are today. One of the best programs, I think, is the Aga Khan program, the Aga Khan International Development Management program. It's longer than others. People have a 1 month, training isn't the right word, a 1 month orientation program in Ottawa, and then are posted with an NGO overseas for 6 months. The training program is really an exposure to the development business. A lot of the people who come, I mean, they really have there's a big demand for this program, and you have to have good marks, but they're also looking for people who've demonstrated an interest in some way or another in international development. Some have already had an internship or traveled or doing development studies for sure. So a lot of them know something about it. The idea of the program in Ottawa is to expose them to the reality of international development, the difficulties in raising money, the problems in managing money, what it's like actually to work with and relate to an NGO in the developing world. They live in completely different worlds from us. They have political problems, funding problems, management problems that are quite different from ours. So this program attempts to put some reality on the studies that people might already have done around development. I think there's another thing that's changing in the development business, as I sometimes call it. There are a lot more NGOs. They're not all good. There is a phenomenon that somebody called Mongos, my own NGO. And if you read about the problem a year later in Haiti, you'll hear one of the critiques is that there are 10,000 NGOs there all rushing around doing things and uncoordinated and unwilling to be coordinated. Everybody and their granny thinks that they can go off and do something. They're not willing or able to join the more professional NGOs, so they create organizations of their own. How many of you have read the book 3 Cups of Tea? Did you like it? Any critique of the book? Anything about the book that struck you as maybe being a little bit off? Not you, but anybody who read it?
Well, he didn't seem to really consult any of the other people who might have been in the area, like doing work there already. It was like this independent thing based on following his climb, and then he felt like he had to give back. So, but like his time, I don't know, it's been very like split between him like back at home and then he's there, and then it's like he must have had advice given to him from other people. But then he doesn't really mention that at all.
Do you remember what his professional background was?
Like a nurse in California.
And do you remember where he lived?
Yeah, he lived for a while just in some, it was a tiny little place. And like, he had his stuff in storage for a while, and then he came back, and he was kind of all over the place in a car or something. Like,
Yeah, he lived in his car.
Yeah.
is a guy who liked mountain climbing. He stumbled down the mountain and stumbled into a village and saw how poor they were and how terrible the education was, and he thought he should do something about it. And he did. He created, obviously, a big organization that is now building schools all over the place. But the thing that struck me about the book is that for all this talk of schools, there is no talk about education. The only moment where he discusses education is where his girlfriend, or his wife by then, and the widow of one of his benefactors are coming to Pakistan. And they're coming up to the area where he's built this school, and they are going to bring with them some appropriate books for the school. Now, these are books that we're going to buy in Islamabad. You can buy books in Islamabad. You can buy appropriate books in Islamabad. But how would two American women who had never been to Pakistan have a clue what was an appropriate book for a school in Balochistan? How would they know? What language were these books going to be in, for example? I mean, there was never any discussion in the book about education. And, you know, the biggest problem in education in developing countries, especially in Pakistan and Bangladesh, two countries I know pretty well, it's not the schools. I mean, schools are a problem. They do need schools, but it's what goes on inside the school that's the issue. You know, if I was going to take that book seriously, I would really want to know what the heck they're teaching. And I just didn't see any description or any discussion of that. I mean, so there's a lot of these, and that book is a huge bestseller. It's been on the bestseller list for ages. And what does it tell you about development? I mean, it essentially tells you that anybody can do it. Even a guy living in the back of an old Buick, in the back seat of an old Buick, can do it. And that this is in some way more, it's better and more, I'm trying to think of the right word, more satisfactory, more satisfying than the long, hard slog that goes into actually educating kids and creating jobs and development and all the rest of it. There's a very sort of superficial idea in a lot of organizations. One in Ottawa, I sort of advised two women who did exactly the same thing. They went to Tanzania to climb Mount Kilimanjaro, and they came down, stumbled into a village, and found girls are in terrible condition. They have no education. They're being married off when they're 15. Everybody's desperately poor. There's no clean water. We have to do something. So they created an organization. 5 years later, they're beginning to understand it's not that easy. They can raise money, but they actually are having a very hard time changing the facts of life in that village. They're just beginning to get it. But they're able to appeal to a whole lot of people because, for some reason, people can get closer to the story if they read 3 Cups of Tea, or if they meet the ladies from Project Tembo, or if you can adopt a child. If I can adopt a child, if I can find the name of a kid and write letters to that kid, that shortens the distance between me and the recipient. That's why child sponsorship is so successful. 75%, I'd say, if you take out church fundraising, 75% of all fundraising in Canada is done on the basis of child sponsorship. Child sponsorship organizations know, and they will tell you if you read carefully, they will tell you that they do community development work. It's not about giving pencils to your kid. It's not about that. It's something much bigger. But most owners don't understand that. They understand the relationship with this child. I write him letters, he writes me letters, and that's what makes me feel good. And it's expensive, high overheads on that kind of thing, and it basically restricts you to where you can work with kids, where you can get the kids. You have to work in those villages. Anyway, just by way of saying that there are NGOs and NGOs, there's all kinds of different opportunities, different places to work. I'm intrigued not just by those kinds of new organizations, but by others, like Engineers Without Borders. Engineers Without Borders, their AGM last weekend in Toronto was their 10th anniversary. I got to know them quite well over the years, and I went to the event. they had 700 students from across Canada. They had chapters at universities all across the country. They had 700 students come in for their annual general meeting. And there were another 500 people there as well. So they had 12 or 1,300 people. They had seminars, all kinds of seminars. They had seminars like yours yesterday, but several going on at the same time. They had attracted all kinds of big names from the development world. John Gitongo from Kenya, who was the corruption czar. Robert Chambers, who's written extensively on rural development. All kinds of terrific people. And the enthusiasm, I mean, it's like you guys. I mean, the enthusiasm among these young people is, you can actually touch it. These are all people who want to get involved in some way. And what they're beginning to realize that they can't accommodate everybody with an overseas posting. They've got two types, long-term, maybe 1-year postings, which they might extend to 2, and then short-term internships. But they're also getting active on campuses. And they're trying to change Canadian foreign policy. They're trying to improve Canadian foreign policy so there's a much heavier emphasis on development and less use of CETA for political and commercial purposes. They had 8 members of parliament at their session last weekend. And I was impressed, not that they got 8 MPs there, MPs will go where there's an audience, but I was impressed with how impressed the MPs were. The MPs were saying, wow, this is fantastic. Here's an organization that is really important and we have to listen. And what they're telling them is, you've got to fix our broken aid program. They have another program where they're trying to green Canadian campuses. So they've got one, I forget which university it is, but they said that every product that is sold on the campus for which there is a fair trade equivalent, they will all be fair trade. So any coffee that is sold on the campus will be fair trade coffee. Any chocolate that is sold on the campus will be fair trade chocolate. So they've greened one of these campuses, and they had the deans of, I think, 15 universities, engineering deans from 15 universities at the meeting as well, and one of them said he would lead the charge, I think, at Waterloo. Engineers Without Borders isn't only for engineers, and what they do overseas is mostly not engineering. They're big on water and sanitation, but it's mostly about managing. It's mostly about thinking how a water and sanitation system can work, and agriculture. But they're not agriculturalists. I mean, they're people who can work in systems and help to organize or reorganize systems. They work with other NGOs, international and local. I know that you don't have engineering here, and maybe you would think of creating an Engineers Without Borders chapter here just because of the name, but I wouldn't let the name put you off. I would contact them if you're interested and see whether or not there is a place at Mount A for this organization. I talked to you about Partnership Africa-Canada and our work on diamonds, and Global Witness and their work on diamonds. And this is another kind of organization, advocacy organizations, who are not thinking so much about aid. They might be thinking about aid, but they're thinking about changing it, not doing it. But they're also thinking about other things. A lot of Canadian NGOs have done advocacy work over the years, but they think of it as a sidebar. They think of it as something they bolt onto the side of what they do. So World Vision has advocacy as one of its 3 or 4 pillars, but if you look at how much they spend on advocacy, it's very, very little. I mean, they'll have 1 or 2 people working on advocacy, and they'll have 15 people working on fundraising. So it's just for most NGOs, it's not a major part of what they do. I think there are new organizations that are thinking, not only is it the thing that we will do, what they're discovering is that you don't have to squeeze the money for this out of child sponsorships, and you don't have to squeeze 3% out of your main program for this kind of thing. You can raise money directly for advocacy work. For the diamond work at Partnership Africa-Canada, all through the 2000s, we were able to raise at least $500,000 a year, and in some years nearly $1 million. There are organizations and governments that understand that things need to change, and they will support it if they like what you're talking about, foundations, governments, and small donors. So I think maybe one more thing to say about all this. I mean, there's a changing world out there. Another way to get into it, sort of a way to get in by the back door, is through the relief stream. There are obviously wars and earthquakes and floods and all the rest of it. And when something like Haiti or the tsunami happens, you'll find the Red Cross and other relief organizations, CARE, Oxfam, all the big ones, have to gear up quickly. And that means staff. They need staff. They may already be in Haiti, but their Haiti operations are mostly developmental. They don't have a lot of relief staff. Suddenly, they've raised a lot of money, and they have to get in there, and they have to start doing things. And they need warm bodies. They need managers. They need people who will roll up their shirt sleeves and work under very difficult circumstances for, let's say, without necessarily expectations of a career. That's one way to get in. If you're going to apply for development jobs, they'll want a master's degree and 5 years experience. Don't be put off by that. They don't always require it. They may say they do, but that's not always the case. But when an emergency comes up, they're looking for people who've maybe lived in a developing country or traveled in the developing world and who have some kind of experience. They have a sudden need for these people, and that's a way of getting in. And I've often said to people, if you really, really want to do this, and you do your homework and have some friends on the ground there, or people who can help at least protect you the first couple of nights you're there, just get on a plane and go. And that's risky. I mean, I'm not telling you to get on a plane and go to Haiti. But my bet is that if you did, and if you knew at least somebody there would give you a bed for a night or two, it wouldn't take you long to find a bit of work. And that, of course, adds to the CV. If you really want a long-term career in international development, you've got to get stuff on your CV. So it means internships, it means volunteer assignments, it means development studies, it means anything that you can do, including this kind of seminar and organizing it and being here and presenting at it. Anything you can do to build up your CV and make you stand out from the large number of people who want to get into this business, who are doing development studies, and who are not like the people who were doing this when I joined. I mean, there just were no development studies. Almost anybody could get in if you did the drool. So let me stop, as I talked a lot more than I intended to, but maybe you've got some questions. I'd be glad to answer any.
I think for university students, it's really important to organize your university life. What kind of plan you want to in which year? So will you suggest us to, if we're going to do some internship or just volunteering, will you suggest us do it in our third year or after graduating?
Both. Either or both. I mean, it really depends what you can get into. There are opportunities. You've got to really research them, and it's not easy to get in. I mean, there's a lot of competition. So, frankly, I would start as early as you can if you're able to.